Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
The ideas that we're saying it stands for, which include human rights and participatory democracy, in my edition, the free market, really make up what we think of as modernity, the modern world.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Mr. Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman. The topic of this week's Reflections is liberal democracy and the role of religion. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Ernie, I wanted to have some serious conversation with you about a particular question that's been sparked by a lot of scholarly debate in the journals and articles and so on about the end of history and about the death of Marxist ideology and the triumph of liberal democracy in the world. That all sounds very heavy to me, but I'm sure we can find some way to make that relevant to people's lives. It has to do with the worldview that really is running what happens in history these days. I mean, what is shaping history? What's the future look like? I suppose a lot of us know this in political terms. And you think in the history in the United States, we went through a strong anti-communist period. And there was, the communists and the Soviet Union were a great threat, and they were expansionist in their policies, which they really were, and wreaked all kind of havoc in the world scene and so on. And there was even a feeling at one time like, look how they're expanding. The Marxists are on the roll around history. The future stands with their ideology. They're expanding and conquering countries and so on. And the United States reaction was, well, we've got to contain them. In fact, we had a policy of containment was the major way of going about this. And we were enemies with these people, and we had to fight against them. And democracy was seen as sort of in retreat around the world. And then suddenly we see changes around where we find an opening to China. President Nixon, a strong anti-communist, through Henry Kissinger, opens up a dialogue with China. Now here we are with Ronald Reagan, strong anti-communist, sitting down and talking with Gorbachev and saying Gorbachev really represents something new. He's beyond Stalin. He's going back and recovering some other roots in the Soviet system. So that might be a way of practically opening this thing up. I mean, the very change we've seen in the mentality of many people in the United States. Not everyone would agree with that analysis, but I think you can see just in the minds of our leaders, something has changed when Ronald Reagan sits down and dialogues with Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union.
Exactly, Jim. But I think it can be also possibly a rather sad time in history. There is a certain nobility when there is something that as a group, as a country, we can go up against, some external threat. It mobilizes us. It pulls us together. It extracts some noble behavior that we're maybe not likely to exhibit when there is no longer an external threat. Is the liberal state, the liberal democracy idea, is that the final idea? Are we embodying it well? And one thing that I would be curious about is what part, if any, does religion have to play in that liberal democracy?
I think that's a really important question, Ernie, and we got to get to it for sure. But can we backtrack just a little bit and talk about, what this liberalism is? I mean, the word liberal, remember, in the last campaign became the L word that people didn't want to say, and yet social scientists and theologians and commentators really use the word liberalism in a much broader sense than that, not referring to the policies of Lyndon Johnson in the war on poverty, perhaps, but a general movement since the time of the Enlightenment that celebrates reason, that says that democracy is important, that we must stand for human rights, that the world will run better if we have a free economy. It's associated with the ideas of Adam Smith and the marketplace and so on. So there's a whole sort of complex of ideas that these authors, these scholars that were we're bouncing off of here. When they say liberalism, they mean something like democracy and free markets, to try to summarize it. And
I would certainly agree on the democracy portion of it. Traditional liberalism as a generic term, exclusive of party politics, means more, to my mind's eye, in terms of rights to freedom and a system of laws generated by the people who are governed, a system of laws to protect the rights to freedom, and that the government only exists by the consent of the governed. Free market, maybe yes.
Well, that's an
maybe no.
economic component in it, I would say. But I mean, I certainly don't want to deny what you said. In fact, I think that's central, this idea of freedom and rights and so on.
And in that sense, regardless of party label or label of small L liberal, small c conservative, the American people seem to agree that this large L liberal is what we subscribe to.
Yes, I mean, but they won't use that word because, I mean, that word very often is seen in some other context, I think. I mean, it's not a popular
Carries a
word.
lot of baggage.
Yeah,
right?
it really does. But the ideas that we're saying it stands for, which include human rights and participatory democracy, in my edition, the free market, really make up what we think of as modernity, the modern world. That takes us back to the Enlightenment, and it's important to see the historical roots of that because the Enlightenment had an anti-religious component. There's the famous scene of erecting the statue of Reason in Notre Dame Cathedral. I mean, a center point of Catholicism, but the symbolic action of putting in there the statue to Reason. In other words, the idea was that reason would rule out religion. We don't need religion anymore because now through rational methods we would be able to control the world. Through science we'd be able to make the world better. In fact, religion and all other authoritarian systems, as they were called, were seen as the great bind on human progress. It's what stopped us from moving forward, and therefore you had to get rid of those things. So, I mean, there's where the roots of this kind of liberalism have a strong anti-religious tone to them, and it's carried through. I mean, then we get with somebody like Marx, who says, yeah, religion, that's right, it does get in the way. It's an opiate. It's like a drug. It puts people's minds on heaven, and therefore we can't adjust or improve the economy or create the classless society that we need to make the world better. There's a perfect example of a strong anti-religious bias built into this long tradition.
And I suspect also, certainly in America, a lot of people read history, and a lot of people are familiar with essentially institutionalized religion in the past, causing wars and killing, and essentially, if you didn't believe what I believed, then that was a good reason for killing each other. Hierarchy, for instance, being related to church. Not everybody being equal, but some were more equal and some were less equal. So I agree, since the Enlightenment, and even today in the United States, the intentional separation of church and state sometimes gets immensely overblown and aggravated, as though they have nothing to say to each other.
Yes, I think that we need to give the Enlightenment some due here based on your analysis there, and that is very often religion did have an intolerance built into it and an exclusivism. All we have to do is look at things like crusades and inquisitions, and when you see that, you see religion has a tendency to become authoritarian and to violate human rights. Now, what the Enlightenment did, I think, was teach us a certain tolerance. In other words, I see that as an enduring value in the Enlightenment. Let me get out my own bias on all of this. My own approach to the Enlightenment, to liberalism, and all that you're talking about is what I call a dialectical one. That is, I want to examine it from the viewpoint of the Judeo-Christian tradition, from the viewpoint of the Scriptures and what I would consider the best of that tradition. In other words, when I look at the Enlightenment, I can say, aha, there's some good things about that. Look at how it helped us to get greater civil rights. greater emphasis on human rights. Even in the 19th century, when the popes, Pope Pius IX being a good example, was blasting the movement forward in terms of rights and the freedom of the press even and things like that, the liberal society was championing those things. I mean, I think that was, a good thing. On the other hand, part of my criticism is that what happened with the Enlightenment is that reason got enthroned, all right, but when it did so, we lost so much else of what is human. We lost all of the positive values of religion. We lost very often the whole imaginative, emotional side of life. And therefore, I think there's many ways in which the Enlightenment needs to be critiqued. And I want to come back to that. But just let me throw out that framework and see if you want to respond to that in some way.
Well, I think of one thing the Enlightenment did essentially was free up physical and social sciences to operate exclusive of a belief in God. And the progress in physical science, since we didn't have to give credit to some external prime cause, then we could do a mechanistic view, a very linear, enclosed view, and understand something of how our world operates. Now, one way...
You're going to get two views on that rise of science. Just let me throw out the alternative is the notion that it's actually the Judeo-Christian tradition which has given rise to science, that it's not strange that science developed in the Western world as opposed to worlds that were governed by a Buddhist or a Hindu worldview, and that the Judeo-Christian worldview said something like that we're stewards of the earth, that we're made in God's image, that we need to shape the world, and that we're a sort of co-creator with God of history. So in fact, I mean, one of the criticisms of the environmental crisis is that it's caused by the Judeo-Christian tradition, because people developed science. I mean, you can go back to the development of science long before the Enlightenment. I mean, when they first started plowing in the monasteries and so on in different ways, and the development of many techniques long before the Enlightenment occurred. So I mean, there are two views on that question.
Certainly dialectic opposites, Jim. I don't have any problem with that. I have a problem, as I suspect you do, with a overreaction in terms of religion playing no role or an entire role in the Enlightenment and things that have happened since then.
Yeah, the point you made that I guess the way I would say it is that various aspects of human existence achieved a certain autonomy. They moved out from underneath the sacred canopy or umbrella of religion, and in doing so, very often discovered something important about human life or the way we operate. In other words, I can grant to you that, when science becomes autonomous, there's a great impetus given to discovery, to invention, to new theories, use of hypotheses, sort of imagining new grand schemes and so on. I think that really is true. Now, some people operated within a religious worldview to do that. So Newton remained a believer and a theist, and moral philosophy was important to him in that sense. So that I think that religion still can play a role there. But I mean, I agree with you that when something like economics or politics or science achieves a certain autonomy, there will often be a spurt or an impetus, an excitement that we can discover and new things and shape the world in a new way. And I think that really has happened historically.
I agree. One way I dichotomize, I would say that objective science is value-free and free of, say, religious overtones, whereas doing science, the practice of science, implies directly the application of values and criteria. And is DNA worth research more important than environmental research? what do we hold to be more valuable? And I would say that values are implicitly informed by a spiritual or religious point of view.
As soon as you have scientists doing science, which you always have, then you have a worldview, a philosophy, an outlook, values at work. I mean, you can't get around that. So that idea of a value-free objective science, I mean, is a theoretical construct, but it doesn't exist because all scientists bring some bias, some outlook, some worldview to their tasks. And the question is, I suppose, as you posed right in the beginning, I mean, what role does religion play in all of that? So I guess to put some form in this, Ernie, I think that we're looking at the Enlightenment, which is this whole rise of the importance of reason. That's that metaphor. Enlightenment suggests that lights go on in the brain, I suppose, that, you know, we get rid of the dark ages when religion dominated. The metaphor of enlightenment suggests we now see clearly and walk in the light where people didn't before. And part of that darkness was associated with the institutional church and with any institutional forms that were going to keep people down. So that's what we mean by the Enlightenment. And the question is, you know, do we assess it positively or negatively? Now, there's a way in which many scholars see it almost in a totally positive way. That it's freeing, it's moved us forward, it's given us democracy, it's given us the free market economy, it's given us civil human rights, and all of that is positive, and they see almost nothing negative about it. In fact, some people see that that's sort of making a final triumph now. There's articles suggesting that the end of history, for example. What they mean by that is that liberal ideals have now triumphed, that there's no competitors anyplace anymore to this Enlightenment ideal. I disagree with that, but that really brings out, I suppose, the positive side of what the Enlightenment's about.
Agree, and yet, of course, we can say, well, now we have it, the final world view, the triumph of rationalism, and then we walk out in the streets or pick up the newspaper and we see poverty and racism and drugs and people killing people or manipulating or taking advantage of. It's possible that the Enlightenment, the rational approach, as pure rational, has reached its outer limit, and we need some sort of paradigm shift or some addition, whether it's mystical or intuitive or a transformation of worldview.
I think you see that in almost all disciplines. Almost all disciplines went through a period where they were almost entirely empirical. They wanted to imitate physics because physics could produce and make effective technologies, and it was all based on hypotheses and checking and the whole empirical method. And you find psychologists who wanted to do that in that way in the universities. I mean, that's how you got grants. If you could show in pure figures, statistics, numbers, empirical evidence, something about the human condition. And you saw it in the social sciences, saw it in politics, sociology. And I see that what you're finding in all these disciplines is some sort of a revulsion against that, a rebellion against that empirical notion, and bringing in some other factors. So you have scientists talking about mystery and awe, much as Einstein did. You have psychologists interested in the human factor. We have the humanistic psychologist, a whole school of thought associated with Rogers and Allport and Maslow, which sort of rebelled against the tight Freudian empirical system. You find it among sociologists, people who recognize the power of religion to shape consciousness and to open up new questions and to provide people with motivation. So you can take any discipline in this century and you can see it moved in a more rationalistic direction, and then that has been challenged and in one way or another is being opened up now. And I think that very often you say, well, see, the Enlightenment was limited. It's not the be-all, end-all of how human life is supposed to be run.
Exactly. I mean, is all we have to look forward to at this point as the fruits of rationalism, more chrome on our automobiles, or just improvement by small amounts in cosmetics, and no improvements in the way that most people are able to live and dream and love and all of the things that make us specifically human.
I think that just to play out the negative things again, is of course that this whole Enlightenment has given us nuclear weaponry also, and has given us pollution, and caused us all kind of problems. It's just not sort of superficiality that we've gotten, that's part of it, but we've also gotten tremendous destruction. We've gotten an environmental crisis as a result. We have an ongoing threat of nuclear warfare, so that we begin to see the ambivalence of science and technology. And what more and more people get to say, well, you got to have some larger framework for thinking about that, for controlling it. Yeah, we can do so many things in a laboratory. We can have genetic engineering, in vitro fertilization, but somebody now has to ask, well, really, is it worthwhile to do those things? Are there human values that have to be considered? And I think almost everybody today can feel that just an Enlightenment ideal doesn't make it, that there's something more to human existence that's gotten factored out in the last centuries, and we have to somehow get back into the mix.
Oh, agree. When you add the Enlightenment to what was done with the theories of Darwin in terms of evolution, social Darwinism, where man is the controller, with some support from, of course, the Old Testament in terms of we have dominion over everything, so as our technology, we become more enlightened, our technology improves, we control more and more, and it becomes an adversarial survival of the fittest sort of relationship where instead of working with people and with nature, we become users of manipulators.